It didn't happen because Congress failed. It happened because Congress allowed it. Before dawn, U.S. forces moved in the Caribbean. A foreign leader was seized. Military power was deployed. And the people constitutionally responsible for authorizing such force found out after the fact. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and this moment matters far more than it first appears. Not because of Venezuela, not even because of Donald Trump, but because this episode exposes a quiet transformation at the heart of American government. Republican leaders were not notified in advance, not due to a legal prohibition, not because the Constitution demanded silence, but because increasingly consultation itself is treated as optional. The explanations came quickly, too sensitive, more like law enforcement, obvious to anyone paying attention. Each excuse feels defensible. Together, they point to something dangerous, a Congress slowly surrendering power not by force, but by habit. If you value analysis over outrage, stay with me. Now, let's step back and examine how this became normal. I want to be precise about what this moment represents. This is not a debate about secrecy versus transparency. It is not a partisan fight over Donald Trump, and it is not even primarily about Venezuela. At its core, this is a question of who decides when American power is used and who quietly accepts being left out of that decision. The Constitution is clear in spirit, even if messy in practice. Congress is supposed to guard the power to authorize war. Presidents are supposed to execute policy, not redefine it. Yet over time, that balance has shifted, not through a single dramatic rupture, but through small, repeated accommodations. Lawmakers defer, presidents act, emergencies are invoked, and extraordinary measures slowly become routine. What makes this episode different is not that Congress was excluded, that has happened before. It's how little resistance followed. The real story isn't what the administration did. It's what lawmakers were willing to tolerate. To understand why, we have to go backward into history, precedent, and the cycles that shape this imbalance. And that's where this story truly begins. We have to go back not just a few years, but decades. This tension between Congress and the presidency did not begin with Donald Trump. It is the product of history, trauma, and habit. After Vietnam, lawmakers tried to reclaim authority. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 was Congress asserting itself a declaration that never again would presidents wage war without consultation. On paper, it was a reset. In practice, it became a ceiling, not a shield. Presidents learned to operate below its thresholds. Short deployments, limited engagements, operations framed as something other than war. Over time, a pattern emerged. Congress would protest, the executive would act, and the system would quietly move on. Each precedent made the next step easier. Each exception widened the gray zone. What we're seeing now is not a sudden power grab. It's the mature phase of a long cycle where speed, secrecy, and fear consistently outweigh deliberation. The raid involving Venezuela didn't break the rules. It exploited how flexible they've already become, and that flexibility sets the stage for the first real test, the moment when theory collided with action. That moment came fast. The first rupture came quietly and then all at once. U.S. forces moved with speed and precision. The mission was over before most Americans knew it had begun. Nicolas Maduro was captured to face an American courtroom. Lives were lost inside Venezuela, and Congress was informed only afterward. This wasn't a hypothetical exercise in executive power. It was the real thing. What made this moment explosive was not just the use of force, it was how that force was justified. Lawmakers were told the operation fit within existing authority, that it complied with the War Powers Resolution, that notification after the fact was sufficient. Formally, that may be true. The law requires notice within 48 hours. And the Gang of Eight did receive a briefing, but substance matters more than procedure. Key lawmakers were excluded. Questions about cost, strategy, an endgame went unanswered. And the operation blended military power with criminal justice in a way Washington has rarely seen. This wasn't declared war, but it wasn't routine law enforcement either. It was something new and deeply consequential. And once that line was crossed, the harder questions could no longer be avoided. What followed was an argument not about what happened, but about what to call it. Some Republicans said this wasn't a military action at all. It was law enforcement, an arrest. No different, they argued, from the FBI taking down a criminal suspect. Yes, the US military was involved. Yes, deadly force was used. But the goal, they said, was not conquest or combat, it was custody. This distinction matters because if it's law enforcement, Congress has no role, no notification, no authorization, no debate. The logic is clean. And that's what makes it powerful. By reframing military force as policing, the executive branch unlocks freedom of action. Speed replaces consent. Secrecy replaces scrutiny. But this reasoning stretches reality. Arrests don't usually involve naval armadas. They don't leave bodies behind in foreign countries, and they don't reshape regional power dynamics. Calling this law enforcement doesn't make it smaller. It makes it more dangerous. Because once force can be relabeled at will, oversight becomes optional. And when oversight becomes optional, the next crisis doesn't feel like an exception. It feels inevitable. Now let's talk about you, because this is where the abstraction ends. When power shifts upward, it doesn't do so in theory. It does so in your name. You're told this is about efficiency, about keeping you safe, about acting fast in a dangerous world. And for a while, it feels reassuring. Decisions are made quickly. Threats seem contained. The machinery of the state looks decisive. But there's a cost you don't see right away. When Congress steps back, you lose a layer of protection. Debate disappears. Trade-offs go unexamined. Mistakes travel faster. You don't get to ask what this operation costs in money, in credibility, in lives. You don't get to ask what happens next. You're simply asked to trust. And trust in a democracy is not supposed to replace accountability. This isn't about whether you support this president or the next one. It's about whether any president should act with so little restraint. If this feels distant, remember, every precedent set abroad eventually comes home. And that's why this moment matters more than it seems. What happens inside Washington never stays there. When the United States acts this way, the world notices. Allies read the signals. Adversaries study the precedents. And global norms quietly adjust. Blurring the line between military action and law enforcement doesn't just affect Congress. It reshapes how American power is understood abroad. If the US can seize a foreign leader without prior legislative approval, framing it as an arrest rather than an act of force, others will claim the same logic. Russia, China, regional powers watching closely. The principle becomes portable. This is how norms erode. Not through open rejection, but through selective imitation. Diplomacy becomes harder. Alliances become less predictable. And escalation becomes easier because ambiguity replaces clarity. The Caribbean operation may have been limited, but its signal was global. It suggested a world where speed matters more than consent, where legal categories are flexible, where power moves first and explanations follow later. And once that signal is sent, it can't be recalled. Which brings us to the hardest question of all. What comes next? The future now branches into three very different paths, and none of them are abstract. The first is the best-case scenario. Congress reasserts itself. The War Powers Resolution is enforced, not just cited. Votes are taken, boundaries are clarified, executive action remains fast but not unchecked. This episode becomes a warning, not a template. The second path is the most likely one. Nothing formally changes. A resolution is debated. It may even fail again. Precedent hardens quietly. Future presidents, Republican or Democrat, inherit a wider lane of action, and Congress adapts by lowering expectations. Then there is the worst-case scenario. The logic used here becomes standard operating procedure. Military force is routinely framed as law enforcement. Inherent authority expands with every crisis. And by the time Congress objects, the constitutional balance has already shifted beyond repair. Systems don't collapse overnight. They drift. What decides the outcome is not law alone, but political will and memory. Whether this moment is remembered as a line crossed or simply another step taken. And that brings us to the final question. What responsibility remains and with whom? Here is the truth we often avoid. Power rarely announces when it's being taken. It waits to be handed over. Nothing in this story required Congress to be silent. Nothing forced lawmakers to accept notification after the fact. Nothing in the Constitution demanded that oversight be treated as a courtesy instead of a duty. This was a choice. And once choices like this become normal, reversing them is far harder than making them. I'm Fareed Zakaria. And the lesson here isn't about one raid, one country, or one president. It's about a democratic system that only works when each branch insists on its role, even when it's inconvenient, even when it slows things down. Especially then, because the real danger isn't executive overreach. It's legislative retreat. If you want to understand how democracies actually change, not through coups, but through consent and complacency, this is where to look. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, stay with me, share it, question it, and keep watching. The next crisis won't ask for permission either.